Now, Daniel Levy is president of the U.S. Middle East Project and a former Israeli political negotiator. He joins us now from London. Good to have you with us, Daniel. So how significant is it that the Israelis are now talking about opening Rafah once the search is done, not once the body of the last captive is found?
Sammy, we're constantly in this tension, aren't we? Between, of course, no one wants to see the triple-digit killings that were taking place prior to October 10th and the so-called ceasefire. No one wants to see the most egregious genocidal actions and starvation. But at the same time, can we really call this a ceasefire? Over 480 Palestinians killed, still what's needed not getting in, and issues like what you just asked. So can we really, Sammy, consider it so significant that more than 100 days after the crossing was supposed to be opened, it might be opened? It will still only be for foot traffic, it seems. It will be under Israeli control. Will Palestinians be allowed back? That's the kind of nickel and diming that Israel always undertakes, and that we should be very clear. If that's what progress looks like, are we really going to see Israel withdraw from the 58% it controls? Are we really going to see the rebuilding of Palestinian life, Palestinian self-governance, the ending of daily killings? So, yes, it's important, but in a broader perspective, it's part of how much of a bluff this ceasefire is and how much Israel is still able to get away with. And the pretense, oh, we've got a problem with the Americans. There is deep Israeli-American alignment on the most crucial and most problematic and dangerous to Palestinian aspects still.
Daniel, might the Israelis really be planning to open Rafah, but in a sort of one-way direction of traffic, not in terms of what was agreed in the 20-point Donald Trump peace plan adopted by UN Security Council Resolution 2803, which in point 12 specifically mentioned that Palestinians should be allowed not only to go, but to return to Gaza? Might that suit Israel in order to ignore that and just say, doors open, get out?
Absolutely, that is one of the things we should be looking at. And the initial Israeli governmental decision was, and I'm talking a few weeks ago now, to open Rafah in one direction only. Why is that both significant and not surprising? Because the Israeli plan is still to displace, ethnically cleanse Palestinians. And we also see in the West Bank the kinds of destruction and displacement taking place. So that is the bigger picture, if you like. If you look at even details that I think we should focus on occasionally, what is this technocrat committee called that will probably not really be given any power anyway? It's called the National Committee for the Administration of Gaza. Anything that has Palestinian in the name is antithetical to Israel, because that's part of the eradication of Palestinians. So what we can expect is that there will probably be a light touch on anything going out of Gaza and a very heavy hand on anything, I'm talking about people, but also goods and, of course, aid, that tries to come back into Gaza. That is the way Israel is attempting to manage that. And if we see the American plans also, still what was represented last week, what was put forward by Jared Kushner in Davos, these gleaming buildings, that's not a future for Gaza the Palestinians have had a hand in putting together. That's still something that has in the back of its mind less Palestinians, as few as possible, the kind of Riviera, the privatization of everything that they have in mind. So yes, that's my expectation for how Israel will attempt to manage that border crossing.
That will be quite different from what the text said of that Gaza ceasefire and Donald Trump plan said. And let's just take a moment, Daniel, stay with us to remind ourselves of some of the points here, because phase 2 of the Gaza ceasefire agreement calls for the reopening of the crucial Rafah crossing with Egypt. The US brokered 20-point plan says the crossing should reopen in both directions for people, as agreed in the January 2025 ceasefire plan. As we mentioned, Israel now says it'll only reopen the border after the search for the body of the last Israeli captive in Gaza is finished, with no confirmation if it will allow movement from both sides. And phase 2 also calls for the crossing to be open for aid and humanitarian access into Gaza. But Israel now says the border will operate under its full oversight and for people only, not for unrestricted aid. So, Daniel, again, looking at the bigger picture of this, if we're not having, we've talked about the point of people might not be moving freely in both directions. There's no indication that they will open Rafah for aid, as was agreed to, right? The bigger picture. What is the picture that emerges then of strangling the Palestinian ability to survive in Gaza while opening a door, not letting food in, but saying, you know, you can go?
Well, I think that shouldn't surprise us. And let's pause for a moment on this issue of the body of Rangvili. Of course, you know, the deceased should have dignity. The family of the deceased should have dignity. But it's precisely that dignity that is denied to the Palestinians, the tens of thousands of Palestinians, probably many more still under the rubble, equipment only being allowed in to look for Israeli bodies, not Palestinian bodies. That dignity denied to the families of those tens of thousands of Palestinians. Because why do I mention that? It shows that even in death, Palestinians are not considered equal. Even in death, the apartheid regime is what reigns here. And that is the bigger project. It's precisely what you pointed out, which is to make Gaza a place where there is not a future for Palestinians, and it doesn't end with
Daniel,
Gaza. It extends to the West Bank. Yes.
Let me jump in and briefly ask you one, I think, key question here that has to be asked. What is likely to be the Egyptian response on the other side of the Rafah border? If this is where things are going, and it sounds like we're talking about suspicion of a continuation of ethnic cleansing, will the Egyptians allow people in? In what sort of quantities? Any restrictions? Do we know if this has been coordinated with Egypt?
Well, I do think that the Egyptian government has tried to hold a line on this for their own national interest. And the Palestinian resilience and attachment to the land means that they haven't rushed the border, despite the most dire of circumstances, to escape. I think Jordan looks at this and they know what's coming in the West Bank if that's allowed to happen. But the big question for Egypt and for the other mediating parties in the region is, how do you manage Trump and how do you manage Israel? China has shown us that if you're big enough, you can stare Trump down. Europe is perhaps showing us that if you come together enough, then you can pose a challenge to Trump the bully. And I think the question for the region is, can you cooperate and come together and use your leverage enough that Israel and Trump cannot get away with their schemes for the region? The hardest part is that will have to include an element of deterring and containing Israel militarily. We're not seeing it yet. They're trying to work with Trump. I don't think it's going so well.
All right. Well, thanks so much, as always. Good to have your analysis, Daniel Levy, there from the US Middle East Project.
Thank you, Sammy.